Hi, and welcome back. To start today, we're going to spend some time defining the idea of globalization. This is obviously a big theme in the class, and it's an idea we're going to be returning to quite frequently. And as we'll discover, people have been thinking and talking about globalization for at least a few hundred years. Today, what we're going to focus on is coming to a reasonable definition of what globalization is, briefly exploring the history of globalization down the years, and outlining the three major theories of globalization that come from your textbook. To start us off on this process, I'd like to direct your attention to the two quotations on the right-hand side of the slide. The first that you see over there was written by Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian communications theorist, and comes from the 1960s. The second one is from Peter Dicken, the British economic geographer, writing a good generation later. Look at these two definitions and think about which one better captures what globalization is all about to you. Does globalization really make the world into a village? Does it make us more aware? Does it make us more responsible? Or is it really about transnational corporations, money, power, and these sorts of things, which are much more empirical and much more reducible to numbers on a flowchart or a spreadsheet? In some ways, of course, you can say globalization is about both. At the same time, I think it's important to understand the ways in which each vision of globalization comes with very different consequences for how we think about the world and for what we're willing to do about global problems and issues. And indeed, people's ideas about globalization have been changing a lot over the course of years. In the medieval period in Europe, globalization or forms of global awareness and global thinking were certainly present in the cosmologies like this one, which helped people imagine a world around themselves in very radically different ways. In medieval cosmologies, the world is divided into three equal parts, typically Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there are clear, bright distinctions seen in those borders around the map between the ecumeny, or the habitable earth, and the barbarian peoples, as they were known, or barbarous peoples, which you see over on the left-hand side of the map. This was a way of making order of the world and of imagining the globe in an integrated way and trying to represent it. Cosmologies weren't based on measurements, quite obviously, as you can see from this map itself. They were based on stories. They were based on travelers' tales and journals and diaries and narratives, which is where you get the strange geographical shapes and those spinal columns of mountains running around here and there. Nevertheless, these are efforts, and this is very important, these are efforts to think about the globe and to think about people's place in relation to the world as a whole. Well, of course, as globalization goes forward down the years, people's practical ways of thinking about the globe are going to change quite dramatically. The book outlines three waves of globalization and sketches them out in a reasonable amount of detail. This slide is really just to give you some of the key points highlighted to let you think about what you should be looking for and what you should be highlighting and taking notes on as you do your readings. So, the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, different political treaties, the Peace of Westphalia and the Treaty of Utrecht, the balance of power system, the Conference of Berlin, and as we roll, of course, into the second wave of globalization, the spread of Europeans around the world through colonialism, and the breakup of the world into nation states. As we get into the third wave of globalization, so basically from World War II or so until the present day, you see a lot of different shifts and a lot of different changes taking place. First, a shrinking world, very obviously. It becomes much faster to communicate with the world as a whole. It becomes much more quicker to get around the world as a whole. At the same time, one of the more striking issues in globalization has been the growth in economic inequality around the world. Inequality is a little bit tricky to measure. If you measure it strictly on a country-by-country basis, if you compare China versus the US today versus China to the US 40 years ago, it'll look like inequality is getting less bad, and it'll look like inequality is getting less severe. If you look, however, at within-country inequality, in other words, inequality inside of a given country, you're going to see a different picture. China is much more internally unequal today than it was 40 years ago. A lot of the wealth that's been created is concentrated in places like Shanghai and Beijing and Hong Kong. In the United States, too, much of the wealth that has been created by globalization over the last few decades has been concentrated in New York, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Other areas of the country have, relatively speaking, gotten poorer to the way they were a few decades ago. Arguably, this is part of globalization as well, and it makes the whole issue very, very thorny and very difficult to unpack. Your book provides a very nice formal definition of globalization, broken down in all of these 4 points, which I think works pretty well for our purposes as we try to pin down exactly what this is. I do, however, want to call attention to point number 2, the magnitude of interconnectedness. This, of course, can mean lots of different things. On the one hand, it can mean people's interconnectedness to each other and people's awareness of moral responsibility. This is the form of interconnectedness that Marshall McLuhan was talking about. On the other hand, one of the big tools of interconnectedness has been the availability of inexpensive electronics communications technologies. How are those technologies built? Well, they're built through global value chains. They're built through these processes of building value into commodities that basically make workers work harder, in less safe conditions, and under a situation which has a lot more exploitation built into it. So we're interconnected to the lives of those workers in China through the commodities we use. And we're interconnected to the lives of workers in Bangladesh and Vietnam through the clothes that we wear. You can look at this process and you can say, well, on the one hand, we're more aware of what goes on in the world. We're more tolerant because we have so much more information. This would be McLuhan's take back from the 60s. On the other hand, you can look at this and you can say, yes, in some ways that's true, but in other ways, we're less conscious, we're less aware, and we're more willing to disregard the consequences of our interconnectedness. And this, and the New York Times series on Apple's operations in China in particular, gives you a little bit of a glimpse into that point of view. At the same time, globalization has multiple other consequences and multiple other issues coming in hand with it as well. The textbook talks about global policy networks, disaggregated states, links to transnational civil societies, and so forth. And for each of these, we can find examples to help make these issues really obvious and real to everyone. Haiti, for example, is a country that largely is governed through the efforts of transnational civil society. It is a terribly, terribly poor country. And if you want to have a job in Haiti that actually pays, and where you're actually going to get paid your salary on a regular basis, you're not going to work for the government. You're going to work for one of the 6,000 or so non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, that basically run the place. The global struggle against AIDS is another example. But a lot of the money and a lot of the attention and a lot of the push to get things done has come through celebrities and through NGOs and through foundations like the Clinton Foundation and the Dell Foundation and the Gates Foundation, which have really put a lot of pressure on national governments to get involved and make sure that AIDS drugs are available to people in the poor world in the same way they are in the rich world. All of this has arguably challenged what state sovereignty means too. Classically, sovereignty means absolute control over a piece of territory. Even rich countries struggle with this one. In the US, we have two very long borders. To the north, we have the longest undefended border in the world. To the south, we have the longest border between a first and a third world country, between the US and Mexico. And of course, guarding and patrolling those borders, or even just defining what successful border control would look like, is a hugely contentious issue. So how sovereign are even rich countries when they have to deal with these issues and when they have to worry about whether their borders are actually secure? Finally, as you think about these issues and as you think about these questions, you can think about them through the three major perspectives on globalization that your text outlines. Basically, hyperglobalists see globalization as inevitable. Some see it as positive, like Tom Friedman. Some see it as negative, like José Bové. But one way or the other, they see it as this force taking over the world. Skeptics basically see globalization as not really changing all that much. Ultimately, there have always been power struggles, there have always been flows of money around the world. The details change, but for people like Karl Marx in the 19th century or Sam Huntington in the 20th, the basic outline remains the same. Transformationists see this differently. They look at globalization as a force for change, but they don't see the changes as coming in the way that we expect them to necessarily. So, for example, globalization has helped make soccer into a truly global game with teams worth a couple of $1 billion, multi-million-dollar salaries, and so on and so forth. It hasn't really changed national sovereignty in doing this, but it's created a whole new class of rich people and a whole economy of superstars that didn't used to be there in the same way. Likewise, when we talk about war, globalization has made it more profitable for private companies to be supplying national militaries with robots and with drones and with all kinds of high tech that comes from the private sector, and as a result has changed the way war is fought, which is an issue we're going to get into a little bit later in this class. The book as a whole, of course, tries to nudge you to the transformationalist point of view and tries to get you to see it as the most persuasive. But of course, there's no necessary reason why you have to agree with this point of view, and you should always feel free as you read through this material to figure out how you feel about what's going on and to disagree with what you're being told, because I think this is a very important part of making sense of a fairly open-ended and complicated subject.